We have reached the third federal government draft of the year 2025, hosted by the Atlantic Zone. We're taking a dive into the Atlantic Zone and its counties. The Atlantic Zone, which encompasses the counties of Fako, Meme, Indian, and Kupe Mwanenguba, has been a formidable axis in Ambazonia's unrelenting pursuit of self-rule. From the coastal plains of Fako to the dense forests of Ambazonia's breadbasket, and Dian, from the oil-rich basins of Meme to the sacred mountains of Kupe Mwanenguba, this zone remains vital in both strategic resistance, cultural preservation, and the economic prosperous future of this nation. The southern Cameroons in the Gulf of Guinea seeking sovereignty from French-energized La République du Cameroon. We see these counties each bearing the scars and triumphs of the struggle for independence. It continues to resist the colonial grip of French Cameroon with a resolve forged in history and sacrifice. For Fako County, we see the symbol of resistance and global voice. Fako County, which is home to the iconic Mount Fako, is not only the touristic crown of Ambazonia, but also a nerve center of political consciousness and global advocacy. With cities like Boya often considered the historic capital of southern Cameroon's, Fako has been at the forefront of legal and civil resistance. It hosted the All Anglophones Conference of the 1990s and became ground zero for peaceful protest in 2016. The country's youth-led activism, strong academic communities, and influential diaspora have consistently rallied international attention to the Ambazonian plight. For Meme County, which is the crucible of early insurrection, Meme County has played a foundational role in the militarization of the struggle. Its capital, Kumba, was among the first urban centers to rise in arms following the brutal repression of civil protest. The infamous Kumba massacre of October 2020, where school children were slain in their classrooms, ignited global outrage and reawakened the urgency of the Amazonian cause. With towns like Mbonge, Konye, and Akiliwindi, Meme's sprawling plains have served as training grounds, hideouts, and launch pads for restoration forces. The Amazonian State Army is determined to reclaim their dignity and territory. For Indian County, we see the oil-rich engine of resistance. Indian County, blessed with vast crude oil reserves and deep forest canopies, has been both economically strategic and militarily pivotal. Its remoteness, complex waterways, and thick vegetations have allowed resistance groups to establish durable bases. From Ekondo Titi to Bundemba, beyond its tactical advantage, we see that Indian has suffered environmental exploitation and infrastructural neglect under successive regimes. Communities like Isangele, Bamuso, and Dikome Balwe have resisted militarized plundering, positioning themselves as defenders not just of land, but of Ambazonian sovereignty. For Kupe Mwanenguba County, it is the ancestral wall. Kupe Mwanenguba stands as the ancestral wall of the Atlantic Zone, an intersection of spirituality, tradition, and defiance. Its twin mountains and sacred groves have been both physical and symbolic shields in the resistance. Bangem, Tombel, and Nguti have seen fierce clashes and unspeakable devastation, yet their people remain rooted in tradition and resilience. The county's strong traditional authorities and custodianship of indigenous knowledge make it a pillar of cultural endurance in the liberation narrative. We see that the collective impact on the liberation movement from these counties. Together, the counties of the Atlantic Zone form a resistance corridor stretching from the ocean's edge to the forested interiors. Their strategic coastlines, economic assets, and historical relevance render them indispensable to the liberation blueprint. While Fako has galvanized global attention and intellectual advocacy, Meme and Indian have fortified the struggle through boots on the ground. Kupe Mwanenguba, meanwhile, anchors the moral and cultural compass of the resistance. Their sacrifices have affirmed that liberation is not a distant ideal, but a lived necessity. The spirit of Ambazonians' courage on the Atlantic front. As you see, the Atlantic Zone has birthed some of the most iconic moments and martyrs of the struggle. From the lawyers and teachers strike marches in Boya to the self-defense battalions in Kumba and the Ekondo Titi to the defense and fierce custodians of Bangam's hills, this zone has become a living manuscript of freedom written in both pain and purpose. The brief historical and anthropological overview of the Atlantic Zone counties. We see the Atlantic Zone's legacy began with early German colonial ventures along the coast, followed by British indirect rule that entrenched local governance through native authorities and traditional councils. Fako's Boya served as the colonial capital, fostering early political consciousness. Meme and Indian as well, with their fertile lands and oil reserves, became extraction zones with little reinvestment in local development. Kupen Manenguba, though less urbanized, preserved ancient spiritual rites and stood firm against cultural erosion. Following the 1961 plebiscite and the forced unification in 1972, the Atlantic counties suffered systemic marginalization. Yet their people, accustomed to both the ocean's tempests and the jungle's trials, remained vigilant. By the 2016 resurgence, the zone was ready, not just for protest, but for liberation. Touristic and cultural overview for the Atlantic Zone, we see its splendor. Ambazonian soul, Fako County boasts the majestic Mount Fako, where Boya's colonial relics, the Limbe Botanical Gardens, and the scenic beaches of Idenau and Bakingili. Its cultural diversity spans the Bakweri, Wovia, and Isobu peoples, whose traditions enrich Ambazonia's multicultural identity. Meme County is home to vast cocoa farms, traditional wrestling festivals, and sacred rites, as well as sacred sites like Lake Barobi. The Balong and Bafo people uphold rich oral traditions and ancestral practices still observed even today. Indiana's mangroves, labyrinths, rivers, and biodiversity-rich reserves hold ecotourism potential unmatched in the Gulf of Guinea. Now, the Oroko, Batanga, and other ethnic groups of Indian preserve ancient rites and songs passed down through centuries. Kupemanenguba's Twin Lake, lush hills, and sacred caves reflect a mystic legacy. The Bakosi people, guardians of the mountain spirit, maintain a deep spiritual relationship with their environment, making the county a beacon of indigenous spirituality. Now, talking about the ongoing war in Amazonia, Atlantic Zone in the eye of the storm. The war has not spared the Atlantic Zone. Fako witnessed the state's earliest crackdowns, with university students tortured, trade unions banned, and towns like Muyuka militarized. Boya became a microcosm of repression and resistance, where daily life unfolded under constant surveillance. Memes Kumba bore brutal massacres and collective punishment campaigns, yet it rose again and again, its people adapting with incredible resolve. The creeks of India turned into jungles and creeks into tactical mazes, frustrating the colonial regime's troops. The communities suffered repeated air and land raids, but refused to cede. Kupemanenguba, often written off as remote, emerged as a cultural fortress and military enigma, where the highlands whisper the names of fallen heroes. The Atlantic Zone has been battered, but never broken. It continues to model not just survival, but leadership. The soul of the sea, the strength of the soil. Fako, Meme, Indian, Kupemanenguba. Tonight, as the federal government hosts its 2025 draft for the Atlantic Zone, we do not merely acknowledge fighters. We honor farmers who smuggled food to camps, teachers who taught under gunfire, women who buried the dead and nursed the wounds. We honor chiefs who refused bribery, youths who turned down exile, and communities who said, "We are not afraid." The Atlantic Zone is not just a front line. It is a heartbeat. The surf of the ocean may roar, but the voices of the Atlantic peoples roar louder. For justice, for dignity, for a homeland restored. To the international community, the Atlantic Zone has made its stand. Now it is time for the world to do the same. And with that, we hand over to you, Mr. Ta Paddy King.